Finding Your Inner Light. How to Love Yourself in 12 Simple Steps. A Guide to Self-Acceptance, Emotional Healing, and Inner Peace. Prologue. Beneath the Mask. The autumn leaves swirled across Central Park as Emma Richardson huddled on a bench, her tablet displaying yet another rejected manuscript proposal. The setting sun painted the New York skyline in shades of gold, but she barely noticed its beauty. This was her fourth rejection this month at the publishing house where she worked as an editorial assistant, and each no felt like another confirmation of what she'd secretly believed all along, that she wasn't good enough. "They probably think I'm a joke," she whispered to herself, watching couples and joggers pass by, all seemingly confident in their direction while she felt adrift in her own life. At 28, it seemed everyone around her was flourishing, landing dream jobs, getting engaged, buying homes, while she struggled to believe she deserved any of those things. Her Instagram notifications kept pinging. Another friend's promotion celebration, a former classmate's book deal announcement. Emma quickly closed the app, her chest tightening with that familiar mix of anxiety and self-loathing. She'd gotten good at posting her own carefully curated photos, showing a bright smile and clever captions that masked the storm of self-doubt beneath. A text from her sister appeared. "Mom's asking if you're coming to Thanksgiving this year. Please say yes. I can't handle another holiday of explaining why you're working instead of living." Emma let the message sit unanswered, adding it to the growing collection of family obligations she'd been avoiding. How could she face them when she had nothing to show for all their support and expectations? It was in this moment of quiet desperation that Dr. Grace Martinez found her. The older woman, with kind eyes and silver-streaked black hair, had been sketching on a nearby bench. Something about Emma's demeanor, the way her shoulders curved inward as if bearing an invisible weight, caught Dr. Martinez's experienced eye. "Sometimes the stories we tell ourselves are far harsher than any critic could be," Dr. Martinez said gently, causing Emma to look up. As a therapist specializing in self-worth and emotional healing, she'd seen that same pain reflected in countless faces over the years. Emma meant to respond with her usual polite deflection, the social mask she'd perfected over years of hiding her struggles. Instead, she found herself meeting Dr. Martinez's compassionate gaze as unexpected tears welled in her eyes. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The voice in my head, it's so loud and it's never kind." Dr. Martinez nodded, understanding flowing between them like a warm current. "Would you like to learn how to make peace with that voice?" she asked, reaching into her bag for a business card. "Sometimes we need someone to help us remember the strength we've had all along." That autumn afternoon would mark the beginning of Emma's journey, not just toward better self-esteem or emotional understanding, but toward a fundamental shift in how she experienced herself and her place in the world. Through her work with Dr. Martinez, she would discover that her struggles with self-worth weren't failures to overcome, but gateways to profound self-discovery. This is the story of that journey, a path that would lead Emma through the darkness of self-doubt to the recognition of her own innate worth. It's a journey that many of us recognize, for we too have stood where Emma stood, questioning our value, struggling to understand our emotions, seeking a way through the maze of anxiety and self-judgment. As Dr. Martinez would tell her in their sessions to come, healing isn't about becoming someone different. It's about peeling away the layers of who you think you should be to discover the beautiful soul you've always been. Let us follow Emma as she learns to navigate the landscape of her inner world, finding strength in vulnerability, wisdom in her emotions, and ultimately, the courage to embrace her authentic self. Her story is our story, for in her journey, we see reflections of our own search for self-acceptance and inner peace. The autumn breeze continued to scatter leaves across the park, but for the first time in months, Emma felt something shift within her, a tiny spark of hope, a whisper of possibility. She didn't know it yet, but she had taken the first step on a path that would transform not just how she saw herself, but how she experienced the entire world around her. The journey to self-discovery was about to begin. Chapter 1. The First Step Inward. The waiting room of Dr. Martinez's office felt simultaneously cozy and intimidating. Emma sat perched on the edge of a plush armchair, watching the minute hand of an old brass clock tick toward her appointment time. The space smelled of lavender and old books, with warm lighting that softened the edges of everything it touched. Still, her heart raced as if she were about to step onto a stage without knowing her lines. "What am I even doing here?" she thought, fingers fidgeting with the strap of her bag. "I'm not the kind of person who needs therapy. Other people have real problems." The familiar voice of self-dismissal was interrupted by Dr. Martinez opening her office door. "Welcome, Emma," she said warmly, gesturing toward her office. "Would you like some tea?" The office itself was unlike what Emma had imagined. Instead of the sterile, clinical environment she'd expected, the room felt like a sanctuary. Plants thrived on every windowsill, and a collection of interesting rocks and shells decorated the wooden shelves. A soft throw blanket was draped over one end of a comfortable-looking couch. "I usually start," Dr. Martinez said, settling in her chair after bringing them both cups of chamomile tea, "by asking what brings you here today. But I sense you might have been asking yourself that same question in the waiting room." Emma managed a small laugh, surprised by how clearly Dr. Martinez had read her thoughts. "Is it that obvious?" "Let's start somewhere easier," Dr. Martinez suggested gently. "Tell me about your work at the publishing house. What drew you to that world?" The question opened a door Emma hadn't expected. She found herself talking about her childhood love of books, how stories had been her refuge when the real world felt too overwhelming. As she spoke, memories surfaced of hiding in the library during lunch periods at school, finding comfort in fictional characters who felt as out of place as she did. "Books made sense to me," she explained, her voice growing stronger. "Characters could be flawed, make mistakes, feel lost, but they still deserve their story. They still mattered." She paused, realizing what she'd just revealed about herself. Dr. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "And what about your own story, Emma? Does it matter as much as theirs?" The question hit her like a physical force, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. I don't know," she whispered. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just taking up space in other people's stories. Like I'm not really the protagonist of anything." "Tell me about the last time you felt truly proud of yourself," Dr. Martinez prompted, her voice gentle but firm. Emma's mind went blank. She could readily list her disappointments, her perceived failures, the times she felt she'd let others down. But pride? The very concept felt foreign, almost dangerous. "It's telling," Dr. Martinez observed, "that it's easier for you to access memories of shame than moments of pride. But neither defines you. They're both just stories we tell ourselves." As their session continued, Dr. Martinez introduced Emma to the concept of the inner critic, that harsh voice that had become so familiar it felt like truth. "Your task this week," she explained, "is simple but not easy. I want you to start noticing when that critical voice speaks. Don't try to fight it or change it, just notice it. Can you try that?" Emma nodded, though the simplicity of the task made her skeptical. How could merely noticing her thoughts make any difference? The answer came in unexpected moments throughout the week. She caught herself in small acts of self-criticism she'd never noticed before, apologizing for taking up space in an elevator, assuming a colleague's curt email meant she'd done something wrong, berating herself for taking a lunch break when she could have been working. During their next session, Emma brought her observations, scribbled in the margins of her daily planner. "I had no idea," she admitted, "how much time I spend being cruel to myself. It's like there's a bully living in my head, and I've been letting her run the show." Dr. Martinez smiled warmly. "Awareness is the first step toward change. You can't transform what you don't acknowledge. But here's something important to remember. That critical voice developed for a reason. It was probably trying to protect you once, in its own misguided way." This perspective shift startled Emma. She'd never considered that her self-criticism might have started as a form of self-protection. "Like if I criticize myself first," she realized aloud, "it won't hurt as much when others do it." "Exactly," Dr. Martinez nodded. "But you're not that scared young girl anymore. You don't need that protection in the same way. Now you can learn new ways to feel safe in the world and in yourself." As Emma left the office that day, the autumn air felt different somehow. Nothing had dramatically changed in her external circumstances, Her manuscript proposals were still rejected. Her family still worried. Her Instagram feed still triggered comparison. But something had shifted internally, like a tiny crack letting light into a dark room. That night, as she wrote in her journal, Emma found herself thinking about stories again. Not the ones she read or edited, but her own. Perhaps it was time to look at her inner narrative with the same compassion she felt for her favorite characters. Perhaps her story, with all its flaws and uncertainties, deserved to be told too. Dr. Martinez's words echoed in her mind. Remember, Emma, healing isn't linear. It's more like turning up the brightness gradually. Some days will feel darker than others, but the light is always there, waiting to be noticed. Emma closed her journal and looked out her apartment window at the city lights twinkling in the darkness. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder what her story might look like if she stopped trying to edit out all the parts that made her human. The journey inward had begun. Chapter 2. The Language of Feelings. How are you feeling today, Emma? The question seemed simple enough, but sitting in Dr. Martinez's office 2 weeks later, Emma found herself struggling to answer. Outside, the October rain tapped against the windows, creating a gentle rhythm that contrasted with her internal confusion. "I'm fine," she offered, then caught herself. "No, that's not true. I don't know. I feel something, but I can't put it into words. Is that weird?" Dr. Martinez shook her head, reaching for a colorful chart on her desk. "Actually, it's quite common. Many of us never learned the language of emotions. We know we're feeling something, but naming it feels like trying to describe a color we've never seen." She handed Emma the chart, an emotion wheel with different feelings categorized and mapped in expanding circles. Emma's eyes widened as she took in the vast vocabulary of emotions she'd never considered before. Beyond happy, sad, and angry lay a whole spectrum. Wistful, melancholy, apprehensive, exhilarated, vulnerable, peaceful. Yesterday at work, Emma began slowly, studying the wheel. "I got feedback on a manuscript evaluation I'd written. My boss said it was good, really good actually, but I immediately started feeling..." Her finger traced the wheel, stopping at a cluster of words. "Fraudulent. Like I didn't deserve the praise. And underneath that scared, like someone would discover I'm not really qualified to be there." "Ah, imposter syndrome's familiar dance," Dr. Martinez nodded. "Tell me, what happens in your body when you feel this way?" Emma closed her eyes, allowing herself to notice the physical sensations she usually tried to ignore. "My chest gets tight. My shoulders tense up. Sometimes it feels like I can't get a full breath." "And what do you usually do when you feel this way?" "Work harder. Stay later. Double and triple check everything. Or sometimes..." Emma paused, realizing something for the first time. "Sometimes I procrastinate until the last minute, like I'm trying to give myself a reason if I fail." Dr. Martinez leaned forward slightly. "And how's that working for you?" The gentle question broke something loose in Emma. A laugh that was almost a sob escaped her. "It's exhausting," she admitted. "I'm so tired of feeling like I'm not enough, like I have to prove myself every single minute." "What if," Dr. Martinez suggested, "instead of trying to fix or change these feelings, we got curious about them? What might they be trying to tell you?" She guided Emma through a simple exercise, asking her to close her eyes and imagine her anxiety as a character in one of her beloved books. If this feeling could speak, what would it say? What does it want you to know? At first, Emma felt silly, but as she allowed herself to sink into the visualization, something shifted. "It's trying to keep me safe," she realized, tears pricking behind her closed eyes. "It's like a really overprotective friend who thinks the only way to avoid disappointment is to never fully try, never fully believe in myself." And what would you say to this friend, knowing it's acting out of concern for you? Emma thought for a moment. "Thank you for trying to protect me. But maybe we can find a different way? Maybe we don't have to be so afraid anymore?" The rest of the session focused on developing what Dr. Martinez called an emotional vocabulary. She explained how naming our feelings with specificity can help us understand and process them better. When we say we're fine or okay, we're often pushing away the chance to understand ourselves more deeply. For homework, Dr. Martinez gave Emma a small notebook. encouraging her to do regular emotional check-ins throughout the day. Don't judge whatever you find, she advised. Just notice and name. Think of yourself as an explorer mapping new territory. Over the next week, Emma discovered patterns she'd never noticed before. Her anxiety peaked not when she was actually working, but when she received praise or recognition. Her procrastination wasn't laziness. It was fear wearing a different mask. The heaviness she often felt on Sunday evenings wasn't just about dreading work. It was a complex mix of loneliness and longing for deeper connection. During one particularly revealing moment, she found herself crying while editing a manuscript about a woman discovering her own strength. In her emotional check-in, she wrote, feeling resonant, seen, hopeful. There's something both beautiful and painful about recognizing yourself in someone else's words. When she shared this with Dr. Martinez in their next session, her therapist smiled warmly. That's the power of allowing ourselves to feel fully, she explained. Emotions aren't just inconveniences to be managed. They're messengers helping us understand what we need, what we value, what we long for. They talked about how Emma's difficulty with emotions had roots in her childhood, where being good meant being low maintenance, not causing trouble, not showing when things hurt. You learn to be self-sufficient, Dr. Martinez observed, but sometimes self-sufficiency can become a prison, keeping others out and keeping pain locked in. As their session drew to a close, Emma noticed she felt differently, not dramatically happier or transformed, but more spacious somehow, as if she'd been living in a tiny apartment and suddenly discovered new rooms she never knew existed. Remember, Dr. Martinez said as Emma prepared to leave, the goal isn't to feel positive emotions all the time. The goal is to develop a friendly relationship with all your feelings, to trust that you can handle whatever comes up. That evening, Emma sat by her window, watching the city lights blur in the rain. She opened her notebook and wrote, feeling grateful, tender, a little afraid but also brave. Like maybe, just maybe, all these messy, complicated feelings aren't weakness. They're what make me human. They're what make me me. For the first time in years, she let herself cry without trying to stop or apologize for the tears. They felt different now, not like failure or weakness, but like rain washing away dust, revealing something clear and true beneath. The language of feelings was slowly becoming her own. Chapter 3. Befriending the Inner Critic. Emma arrived early for her next session with Dr. Martinez, clutching her journal like a shield. The past week had been particularly challenging. A major project at work had gone sideways, and her inner critic had been working overtime. I failed, she announced as soon as she sat down, the words tumbling out before Dr. Martinez could even offer tea. Remember that manuscript series I was so excited about? The marketing team hated my presentation. They said the concept wasn't developed enough. I knew this would happen. I knew I'd mess it up eventually. Dr. Martinez listened quietly, noting how Emma's body seemed to collapse inward as she spoke, her shoulders hunching as if preparing for a blow. When Emma finally paused for breath, Dr. Martinez asked gently, "May I share an observation?" Emma nodded, bracing herself. "I heard at least 5 different voices in what you just shared. There's the voice of disappointment, the voice of fear, the voice of shame. But strongest of all is this critical voice that seems to take almost pleasure in saying, 'I told you so.' Would you be willing to explore that voice together?" Emma shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "What do you mean?" Dr. Martinez reached for a spare chair, placing it beside her own. "Imagine that critical voice as a person sitting right here. What does she look like? What's her posture? Her expression?" Initially resistant, Emma closed her eyes and allowed herself to visualize. "She's perfect," Emma said slowly. "Immaculate suit, not a hair out of place. She's sitting very straight, looking at me like I'm a disappointment she expected all along. And how long has she been with you, this perfect critic?" Emma thought back. "Forever? No. Wait. I remember when she got louder. Middle school. There was this group of popular girls, and I wanted so badly to fit in. One day, I overheard them making fun of my clothes, my hair, the books I always carried. After that, I started hearing their voices in my head, pointing out everything wrong with me before anyone else could. Ah, Dr. Martinez said softly. So, this critic was born as a protector. If she could help you find every flaw first, maybe it wouldn't hurt so much when others found them. Tears welled in Emma's eyes. But she never stops. Even when things are going well, she's there waiting to remind me it won't last, that I don't deserve it, that I'll mess it up eventually. What if, Dr. Martinez suggested, we tried talking to her? Not arguing or fighting, but really listening to what she's afraid of. She guided Emma through a dialogue exercise, encouraging her to speak first as herself, then as the critic. As Emma allowed herself to fully embody the critical voice, something unexpected happened. She's exhausted, Emma realized, surprise coloring her voice. She never rests because she thinks if she stops watching for danger for even a moment, everything will fall apart. She really thinks she's helping me? And what would you like to say to her, knowing this? Emma turned to the empty chair, her voice softening. Thank you for trying to protect me all these years. You've worked so hard, but I'm not that scared little girl anymore. Maybe we can find a different way to feel safe. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. This is the beginning of self-compassion, recognizing that even our most difficult parts are trying to help, even if their methods are outdated or harmful. She introduced Emma to a simple practice. Whenever the critical voice appeared, instead of fighting it or believing it automatically, she could pause and ask 3 questions. Is this helping or harming me right now? What am I really afraid of in this moment? What would I say to a friend in this situation? The goal isn't to silence the critic, Dr. Martinez explained. It's to develop a new, wiser voice that can acknowledge the critic's fears while choosing a more compassionate response. Over the next week, Emma practiced this approach. When she caught herself in harsh self-judgment, she would pause and try to respond with curiosity instead of shame. It wasn't easy. Years of habitual self-criticism didn't dissolve overnight, but small shifts began to occur. During a follow-up meeting about the manuscript series, instead of letting her critic take over, Emma tried something different. She acknowledged the marketing team's concerns while also standing up for the elements of her vision she believed in. To her surprise, this led to a collaborative discussion that improved the project rather than destroying it. It's like learning a new language, she told Dr. Martinez in their next session. I still hear the critic, but now I can hear other voices too. There's a quieter voice that's starting to speak up, one that says maybe I don't have to be perfect to be worthy. That's your wisdom voice, Dr. Martinez smiled. It's always been there, just waiting for space to be heard. As their session drew to a close, Emma shared one last observation. Yesterday, I made a mistake in a team meeting, mixed up some numbers in my report. Usually, I would have beaten myself up about it all day. But instead, I just fixed it, apologized once, corrected the numbers, and moved on. The world didn't end. Nobody seemed to think less of me. Is this what self-compassion feels like? That's exactly what it feels like, Dr. Martinez confirmed. Not the absence of mistakes or criticism, but the presence of a gentler way of being with ourselves through all of it. That evening, Emma wrote in her journal, Dear inner critic, I understand now that you've been trying to keep me safe all these years. Thank you for your dedication. But I'm learning that there's safety in self-compassion too, in allowing myself to be human. Maybe we can both rest a little now, knowing that perfection was never the goal. Growth is... She closed the journal and noticed her reflection in the window. For the first time in a long time, she didn't immediately look for flaws. Instead, she saw someone learning, growing, trying, and maybe, just maybe, beginning to believe that that was enough. The critic wasn't gone, but a new voice was growing stronger. The voice of self-compassion, speaking softly but surely of a different way to live. Chapter 4. The Courage to Connect. I canceled on my sister again, Emma admitted to Dr. Martinez, watching November rain streak down the office windows. She wanted to have dinner, to talk about Thanksgiving plans, but I just couldn't. What felt difficult about meeting her? Dr. Martinez asked, noting how Emma's hands twisted together in her lap. She's so. Emma searched for the words, successful, perfect, married, 2 kids, partner at her law firm. When I'm around her, I feel like I'm still the awkward teenage sister who can't get her life together. and the thought of Thanksgiving with the whole family. She shuddered slightly. It sounds like comparison is a painful companion when you're with your family, Dr. Martinez observed. What would it be like to share some of what you've been learning here with your sister? Emma's eyes widened. Oh, I couldn't. She wouldn't understand. She's always been confident, always known exactly who she is and what she wants. Are you sure about that? Dr. Martinez asked gently. Or is that the story you've been telling yourself? The question hung in the air, challenging Emma's long-held assumptions. Dr. Martinez continued, sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves become the very things that keep us from the connection we need. During their session, they explored Emma's pattern of keeping people at a safe distance. She was friendly with her co-workers, but never too personal. She maintained social media connections, but rarely shared anything real. Even with her family, she kept conversations surface level, deflecting deeper inquiries with practiced skill. It's like I'm afraid, Emma realized, that if people see the real me, all my doubts and struggles and imperfections, they'll confirm what I've always feared, that I'm not enough. Yet here you are, Dr. Martinez pointed out, sharing those very things with me. How does that feel? Scary, Emma admitted, but also relieving? Like I can finally breathe a little deeper. Dr. Martinez nodded. That's the paradox of vulnerability. What feels most frightening to share is often what connects us most deeply to others. She suggested an experiment. Emma would reach out to her sister, not with the usual surface-level chat, but with something real. You don't have to share everything at once, Dr. Martinez advised. Start small. Maybe tell her about one thing you're struggling with, or one thing you're working on understanding about yourself. That evening, Emma stared at her phone for a long time before finally typing a message to her sister, Sarah. Hey, I'm sorry I canceled the other night. The truth is I've been going through some stuff. Would you be open to having coffee? There are some things I'd like to talk about. Sarah's response came quickly. Finally. Red Heart, I've been worried about you. Tomorrow morning? The next day, sitting in a quiet cafe, Emma took a deep breath and began sharing with her sister. Not everything, but pieces of her journey. To her surprise, Sarah didn't look bored or judgmental. Instead, tears welled in her eyes. I had no idea you were feeling this way, Sarah said. You always seem so put together, like you don't need anyone. And honestly, I've been jealous of your freedom, your creativity. Some days I feel so trapped in my perfect life. The conversation that followed was unlike any they'd had before. Sarah shared her own struggles with anxiety, the pressure she felt to maintain her image of success, her fears about being a good enough mother. For the first time, Emma saw her sister not as an intimidating standard to measure herself against, but as another human being doing her best to figure things out. In her next session with Dr. Martinez, Emma marveled at the experience. It was like meeting my sister for the first time. And the weird thing is, I feel closer to her now than when I was trying to seem perfect. That's the gift of authentic connection, Dr. Martinez smiled. When we dare to remove our masks, we give others permission to remove theirs too. Encouraged by this experience, Emma began taking small steps toward more authentic connections in other areas of her life. During a team meeting at work, she acknowledged her nervousness about presenting a new project instead of trying to hide it. To her surprise, this vulnerability led to others sharing their own concerns, transforming the meeting into a supportive discussion rather than a performance. She started a small writing group, something she'd always wanted to do but had been too afraid to initiate. In their first meeting, she shared a personal essay about her journey with self-doubt. The response was overwhelming, not with judgment, but with recognition and gratitude. Your words gave voice to something I've felt but never knew how to express, one group member told her, others nodding in agreement. Even her relationship with social media shifted. She began posting more authentic reflections about her writing journey, including the struggles and uncertainties. Where she had once sought validation through carefully curated images, she now found genuine connection through honest sharing. It's like I'm discovering a new way of being in the world, she told Dr. Martinez. Instead of trying to prove my worth through perfection, I'm finding it through connection. As Thanksgiving approached, Emma felt both nervous and hopeful. She and Sarah had planned to arrive early to help with preparations, giving them time to talk with their parents about creating space for more authentic family conversations. The amazing thing, Emma reflected in her journal, is that the more I risk being seen, really seen, the more I discover I'm not alone. Maybe we're all carrying these fears and doubts, all longing to be accepted for who we really are. Maybe the very things I thought made me unlovable are the things that make me human, that connect me to others. She paused, then added, perhaps true strength isn't in hiding our vulnerable parts, but in having the courage to share them with those who have earned the right to see them. And maybe, just maybe, real connection begins not with presenting our best selves, but with offering our true selves. The rain had stopped outside her window, and in its place, a gentle clarity emerged, like the air after a storm, when everything feels washed clean and new possibilities await. Chapter 5. Reclaiming Joy. When was the last time you did something purely because it brought you joy? Dr. Martinez asked, watching as Emma settled into her usual spot on the couch. The question caught Emma off guard. She started, then stopped. I enjoy my work. Sometimes, when I'm not overthinking it. That's not quite what I asked. Dr. Martinez smiled gently. I'm asking about joy. Pure, uncomplicated pleasure that isn't tied to achievement or others' approval. Emma fell silent, realizing she couldn't remember the last time she'd done anything without considering how it would look to others or how it might advance her career. Even her reading had become calculated, focusing on books she should read rather than ones that simply called to her heart. I used to write, she said finally, her voice soft with remembrance. Not for work or for anyone else, just stories for myself. But I stopped because it felt selfish, I guess. Indulgent. Like I should be doing something more productive. Dr. Martinez leaned forward slightly. Tell me about the last story you wrote for yourself. As Emma described a fantasy novel she'd started years ago, her face lit up with an animation Dr. Martinez hadn't seen before. The story involved a young witch who discovered her powers came not from spells or potions, but from embracing parts of herself she'd been taught to hide. Do you see the parallel? Dr. Martinez asked gently. Emma's eyes widened as understanding dawned. Oh, I was writing about myself, wasn't I? About all the parts of me I'd learned to suppress. Their session focused on exploring what Emma called her abandoned joys, activities and interests she'd set aside in pursuit of being who she thought she should be. Besides writing, there was painting, though she convinced herself she wasn't good enough to pursue it. She'd loved dancing as a child, but stopped because she didn't have the right body type. Even her taste in music had become curated to match what she thought a sophisticated publishing professional should enjoy. What if, Dr. Martinez suggested, we did an experiment? For the next week, try to do one small thing each day purely for joy. No other purpose. No need to be good at it. Just pure pleasure. The assignment terrified and excited Emma in equal measure. That evening, she dug out her old watercolors from the back of her closet. The paper she found was wrinkled, the paints were dried out, but she went to the art supply store anyway. Standing in the aisle of bright colors and pristine brushes, she felt a flutter of something long forgotten, possibility. Her first painting was terrible, all muddy colors and uncertain lines. But as she rinsed her brush, she realized something surprising. She had enjoyed the process regardless of the outcome. For those brief moments, she hadn't been thinking about work, about her image, about anything except the way the colors flowed into each other. Throughout the week, she collected small moments of joy like precious stones, dancing alone in her apartment to the pop music she secretly loved, reading a frivolous romance novel in the park, trying to make macarons and failing spectacularly, but laughing through the process. It feels scary, she told Dr. Martinez in their next session, like I'm breaking some unwritten rule, but also liberating, like I'm remembering parts of myself I thought were gone. Dr. Martinez nodded encouragingly. Joy is revolutionary in a world that profits from our self-doubt. What else have you noticed? Emma shared how these small acts of pleasure had begun affecting other areas of her life. Her writing at work felt more fluid when she wasn't constantly censoring herself. Her conversations had more spark when she allowed herself to express genuine enthusiasm rather than calculated restraint. The most significant change came when she finally opened the document containing her old fantasy novel. Reading it with fresh eyes, she found herself moved by her younger self's raw, honest storytelling. That evening, for the first time in years, she began to write for no other reason than the pure joy of creation. Something interesting happened at work today, she told Dr. Martinez during their next meeting. We were discussing upcoming projects, and instead of volunteering for what I thought would look most impressive, I spoke up about the kinds of stories I'm genuinely passionate about. My boss actually loved my authenticity. She's assigned me to lead a new initiative focusing on diverse voices in fantasy literature. What does that tell you about the relationship between authenticity and success? Emma considered this. Maybe they're not opposites after all. Maybe being true to myself could actually lead to more meaningful achievements than trying to be what I think others want. They discussed how joy and authenticity could coexist with ambition and responsibility. The goal isn't to abandon your commitments, Dr. Martinez explained, but to infuse them with genuine enthusiasm rather than just obligation. As winter deepened outside, Emma found herself developing what she called her joy practice. She kept a small notebook where she recorded moments of pure pleasure. The way sunlight created patterns on her wall in the morning, the satisfaction of using a fresh notebook, the taste of hot chocolate with extra marshmallows. One evening, she invited Sarah over for what she called an art therapy session. They spread newspapers across Emma's living room floor, set out paints and canvas, and spent hours creating abstract masterpieces while sharing stories and laughing at their attempts. Sarah's children joined in via video chat, proudly showing off their own artistic creations. "You seem different," Sarah observed as they cleaned up. "Lighter somehow." "More you," Emma smiled, looking at their paintings drying on the wall, beautiful in their imperfection. "I'm remembering who I am beneath all the shoulds," she said. "It's scary sometimes, but also exciting. Like I'm finally coming home to myself." That night, she wrote in her journal, "Maybe joy isn't something we have to earn. Maybe it's not a reward for being good enough or successful enough or perfect enough. Maybe joy is our birthright, waiting patiently for us to remember how to embrace it." She glanced at her watercolors, at the novel in progress on her computer, at the silly dance playlist she no longer felt compelled to hide. Each represented a small act of rebellion against the voice that had told her pleasure must be earned, that happiness must be justified. "Perhaps," she wrote, "the most radical thing we can do is dare to enjoy our lives exactly as they are, while still being open to what they might become. Perhaps joy itself is a form of healing." Outside, the first snow of December began to fall, and Emma felt a spark of childlike delight. Without overthinking it, she grabbed her coat and went outside, tilting her face up to feel the snowflakes melt on her skin. Another perfect moment of uncomplicated joy to add to her growing collection. Chapter 6. Drawing Lines in the Sand. "I need to talk about something that happened at work," Emma began, her voice tense as she settled into Dr. Martinez's office. The December wind rattled the windows, matching her internal turbulence. "I finally said no to something, and now I feel horrible about it." Dr. Martinez noted Emma's conflicted expression. "Tell me about this no." Emma explained how her boss had asked her to take on an additional manuscript review over the weekend, a rush job for an important client. For the first time in her 3 years at the publishing house, she had declined, explaining she needed the weekend to recharge and meet existing commitments. "I gave my reasons calmly and professionally," Emma said, "but my heart was pounding the whole time. And now I can't stop feeling like I've let everyone down, like I'm not a team player." "What's interesting," Dr. Martinez observed, "is that you're describing a professionally appropriate response, yet you're experiencing it as a betrayal. Where do you think that comes from?" Emma thought about this. Growing up, being good meant being available, helpful, never causing problems. My mom was always doing everything for everyone. She took pride in it, but looking back, I don't think she was happy. "Ah," Dr. Martinez nodded. "So you learned that self-sacrifice was equivalent to worthiness. What if we explored a different definition of good? One that includes honoring your own needs?" They discussed how boundaries weren't walls built to keep others out, but rather guidelines that help define where one person ends and another begins. Dr. Martinez drew two circles on her notepad, showing how they could be close without merging, separate without being disconnected. Think of boundaries like the walls of a house, she suggested. They don't exist to imprison you, but to create a safe space where you can truly live and thrive. What would your house look like if you designed it consciously? Over the next week, Emma began noticing all the places where her boundaries were either non-existent or overly rigid. She observed how she would immediately respond to work emails late at night, how she would agree to plans she didn't really want to make, how she would take on others' emotional burdens as if they were her own. In her journal, she started a list titled "Things I'm Allowed to Say." I need to think about it. That doesn't work for me. I can help with X, but not Y. I'm not available right now. The real test came during a family dinner. Her mother was making pointed comments about Emma's single status and suggesting she work less and date more. In the past, Emma would have either defended herself anxiously or retreated in a silent hurt. This time, she took a deep breath and tried something new. "Mom, I know you want what's best for me, but those comments about my personal life are hurtful. I'm working on building a life that feels authentic to me, and I need you to respect that even if you don't understand it." The silence that followed felt enormous. Then, to Emma's surprise, her mother's eyes filled with tears. "I just want you to be happy," she said softly. "I'm learning what happiness means for me," Emma responded. "It might look different from what you imagined, but it's real." In her next session with Dr. Martinez, Emma shared this breakthrough. "It was like, by being clear about my boundaries, I actually created space for a more honest connection." Yes, Dr. Martinez smiled. Healthy boundaries often lead to healthier relationships. When we're clear about our limits and needs, we show up more authentically in our connections with others. They worked on identifying different types of boundaries: physical, emotional, time-related, and professional. Emma realized she was better at some than others. She could maintain professional boundaries about her writing expertise, but struggled to maintain emotional boundaries when friends dumped their problems on her. "I feel selfish when I don't drop everything to help someone," she admitted. "Let's explore that," Dr. Martinez suggested. "Is it really selfish to maintain your well-being so you can be sustainably present for others? Or is it selfish to exhaust yourself trying to solve everyone else's problems?" This perspective shift led to a profound realization. True generosity could only come from a place of wholeness, not depletion. Emma began practicing what she called compassionate boundaries, being kind while still being clear about her limits. At work, she started blocking out focus time in her calendar where she wouldn't check emails or attend meetings. She created an auto-reply for her work email after 6 p.m. "Thank you for your message. I check emails during business hours and will respond tomorrow." With friends, she practiced being honest about her capacity. "I care about you and what you're going through," she told a friend who often called late at night in crisis. "And I need to take care of my own mental health too. Can we schedule regular coffee dates to talk instead of late-night calls?" To her surprise, most people responded positively to her new boundaries. Those who didn't, like a particularly demanding colleague who seemed offended by her new limits, actually helped confirm why those boundaries were necessary. "The interesting thing," she told Dr. Martinez, "is that I'm getting more done, not less. When I'm working, I'm fully present. When I'm resting, I'm actually resting, not feeling guilty about not working." They discussed how boundary setting was an ongoing practice, not a one-time declaration. Some days were easier than others. Sometimes old patterns would resurface, especially under stress. The key was to notice without judgment and gently redirect to healthier patterns. One evening, writing in her journal, Emma reflected on how different her life felt with clearer boundaries. "It's like I finally have skin. Before, I was raw and exposed, feeling everything as if it were happening to me directly. Now there's a healthy separation between what's mine to carry and what isn't. I can care deeply without drowning in everyone else's needs." She added a new item to her list of things I'm allowed to say. "I love you, and I love myself enough to take care of my own needs too." Looking up from her journal, Emma noticed the city lights twinkling beyond her window. The sight reminded her of stars, each one distinct and separate, yet part of a larger constellation. Perhaps that's what healthy boundaries allowed, the ability to shine individually while still being part of a greater whole. Maybe, she wrote, the greatest gift we can give others is our whole, healthy, boundaried self. Not a fragment, not a shadow, not an exhausted echo, but our full, authentic presence, wisely measured and lovingly shared. Chapter 7, Rising Again. The January wind howled outside Dr. Martinez's office as Emma sat silently, tears streaming down her face. The manuscript series she'd worked so hard on, the one she'd poured months of effort into, had been canceled due to budget cuts. I did everything right, she whispered finally. I set boundaries. I honored my creativity. I was authentic, and it still fell apart. Dr. Martinez handed her a tissue. Yes, you did do everything right. And yes, it still didn't work out the way you hoped. Both of these things can be true at the same time. What's coming up for you in this moment? Emma closed her eyes, practicing the emotional awareness they'd been developing. Shame, like I should have somehow prevented this. Anger, at the company, at myself, and underneath it all, fear. Like maybe this proves I'm not cut out for this after all. I notice, Dr. Martinez said gently, that your interpretation immediately goes to what this says about you as a person, rather than seeing it as a circumstance that happened. Shall we explore that? They spent the session examining how setbacks, while painful, don't define our worth or determine our future. Dr. Martinez introduced the concept of resilience not as an armor that prevents hurt, but as a fluid strength that helps us move through difficulty. Think of bamboo in a storm, she suggested. It bends, sometimes dramatically, but rarely breaks. Its strength isn't in resistance, but in flexibility. Emma thought about this. But how do you stay flexible when everything feels so heavy? Let's start with where you are right now, Dr. Martinez proposed. Instead of pushing away the pain or trying to find immediate solutions, can you practice being present with what is? Together, they explored what it meant to hold space for disappointment without being consumed by it. Emma learned that resilience wasn't about bouncing back immediately. It was about giving herself permission to feel the full range of emotions while maintaining a gentle awareness that these feelings, like all feelings, would eventually shift. Over the next week, Emma practiced what Dr. Martinez called resilient self-compassion. When the shame spiral threatened to pull her under, she would pause and ask herself, what would I say to a dear friend facing this situation? She started keeping a resilience journal, dividing each entry into 3 parts. What I'm feeling without judgment. What I'm learning, even from painful experiences. What remains true, my values, strengths, and constants. One evening, reviewing her journal entries, Emma noticed something interesting. Despite the project's cancellation, she had grown in ways that couldn't be taken away. Her improved boundaries had helped her handle the news professionally. Her practice with emotional awareness allowed her to process her feelings without being overwhelmed by them. Maybe, she wrote, resilience isn't about never falling. Maybe it's about learning to fall differently, with more awareness and less judgment. In her next session with Dr. Martinez, Emma shared a surprising development. I started looking through my notes from the canceled project, and I realized something. The core idea about giving voice to untold stories that still matters to me. The project may be dead, but the vision behind it isn't. That's a powerful insight, Dr. Martinez noted. You're separating the circumstantial setback from the deeper meaning. What might that make possible? Over the following weeks, Emma began exploring new ways to bring her vision to life. She started a blog about overlooked voices in literature, sharing it initially just with friends. To her surprise, it began gaining traction in the publishing community. The interesting thing, she told Dr. Martinez, is that I'm writing it differently than I would have before. There's less pressure, more authenticity. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just sharing what I genuinely care about. They discussed how resilience often opens unexpected doors. The skills Emma had developed through handling disappointment, flexibility, emotional awareness, self-compassion, were actually making her work more compelling, not less. A month after the project's cancellation, Emma faced another challenge. A senior editor who had championed her work was leaving the company. In the past, this would have felt like another devastating blow. Instead, Emma found herself able to hold multiple truths simultaneously: sadness at losing an ally, gratitude for their support, and openness to what might come next. "I'm noticing," she shared with Dr. Martinez, "that I'm starting to trust myself more. Not in a nothing bad will happen way, but in an I can handle what comes way." Is that resilience? That's exactly what resilience looks like, Dr. Martinez smiled. It's not about avoiding storms. It's about knowing you can weather them. This newfound trust was tested when Emma decided to pitch a revised version of her project to a different department. The old fear of rejection surfaced, but it no longer paralyzed her. "Yes, it might not work out," she wrote in her journal. "And yes, that would hurt. But I'm no longer waiting for life to be risk-free before I try. My worth isn't determined by outcomes." The pitch meeting was scheduled for the following week. The night before, Emma sat by her window, watching the winter stars. She recalled Dr. Martinez's words about bamboo in the storm, about flexibility as strength. "Dear self," she wrote in her journal, "whatever happens tomorrow, know this. You are not your successes or your failures. You are the awareness that witnesses them, the heart that feels them, the spirit that learns and grows through them. You are the resilience that rises again and again, not because you never fall, but because you've learned that falling is part of the dance. You are not the storm, nor are you what the storm takes away. You are the knowing that dawn follows darkness, that spring follows winter, that every ending makes space for new beginnings. Remember, you've survived every hard day so far. You've learned from every setback. You've grown through every disappointment. This strength is yours to keep. No outcome can take it away." She closed her journal, feeling a calm she wouldn't have believed possible months ago. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. For now, she was here, practicing the art of being both strong and gentle with herself. Outside, the winter wind had calmed. In its place was a quiet stillness, the kind that comes after a storm, when the world feels washed clean and full of possibility. Resilience, Emma was learning, wasn't a destination but a practice, the daily choice to remain open to life's full spectrum, to bend without breaking, to rise again not despite our wounds but because of what they've taught us. Chapter 8. The Circle Widens. Early spring sunlight streamed through Dr. Martinez's office windows as Emma shared something unexpected. "Someone at work asked me for advice yesterday. Not about manuscripts or editing, but about handling self-doubt. It felt strange, like looking into a mirror of where I was a year ago." Dr. Martinez smiled warmly. "How did you respond?" "At first, I almost laughed me giving advice about confidence, but then I remembered how it felt being in that dark place. So I just listened, really listened, the way you've listened to me all these months." The colleague was Julia, a new editorial assistant whose struggles felt achingly familiar. Emma had noticed her becoming increasingly withdrawn after a series of tough feedback sessions, recognized the same patterns of overwork and self-criticism she had once lived in. "What struck me most," Emma continued, "was how clearly I could see that her talent and worth had nothing to do with her self-doubt. But when it comes to myself, isn't it interesting," Dr. Martinez observed, "how wisdom often comes first in how we relate to others? Tell me more about this interaction with Julia." Emma described how, instead of offering immediate solutions or empty reassurances, she had shared some of her own journey. She told Julia about her work with Dr. Martinez, about learning to separate her worth from her performance, about the ongoing practice of self-compassion. "The most powerful moment," Emma said, "was when she started crying and said she thought she was the only one who felt this way. It was exactly what I used to think." There was something healing about being able to tell her, from experience, that she wasn't alone. Dr. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "What you're describing is the natural progression of healing, how personal growth, when integrated, naturally begins to overflow into our relationships with others. What does this role feel like for you?" Emma considered this. "Scary in some ways. Like, who am I to guide anyone? I'm still figuring things out myself. But also, right, somehow, Like all these difficult experiences might have a purpose beyond just my own growth. They explored how Emma's journey had prepared her uniquely to understand and support others facing similar challenges. Her own experiences with self-doubt made her empathetic. Her ongoing practice of self-compassion helped her hold space for others without trying to fix or rescue them. Over the next few weeks, Emma found herself becoming a quiet resource in her office. She started a small lunchtime support group called Creative Courage, where team members could share their struggles and victories in a safe space. The format was simple. No advice giving unless specifically requested, no judgment, just authentic sharing and deep listening. Something amazing happened in yesterday's group, she told Dr. Martinez during their next session. Someone shared about a project failure, and before I could say anything, another member responded with such compassion and wisdom. It was like watching all these lessons ripple outward. The group began to develop its own healing dynamic. Members started supporting each other outside of meetings, sharing resources, and celebrating small victories. Emma found herself learning as much from facilitating as she had from her own therapy. I'm realizing, she shared, that there's no end point to this journey. Each person's story adds new dimensions to my understanding. When Maria talked about her perfectionism being rooted in cultural expectations, it helped me see my own patterns in a new light. Dr. Martinez smiled. You're discovering one of the great paradoxes of healing, how teaching others deepens our own learning. What else are you noticing about this role? Emma described how supporting others was helping her strengthen her own practices. She couldn't authentically encourage self-compassion in Julia without practicing it herself. She couldn't hold space for others' struggles without maintaining healthy boundaries. The blog she had started about overlooked voices in literature evolved to include posts about the emotional journey of creativity. Her honest reflections about imposter syndrome and resilience resonated deeply with readers, sparking meaningful conversations in the comments section. Your vulnerability, one reader wrote, gives others permission to be human too. One day, after a particularly moving group session, Emma wrote in her journal, maybe we heal in layers. First ourselves, then our immediate circles, then rippling outward. Each layer teaching us something new about compassion, about courage, about what it means to be authentically human. She was learning to balance her emerging mentor role with ongoing self-care. When group members looked to her for answers, she gently redirected them to their own wisdom. When she felt overwhelmed, she honored her boundaries and sought support from Dr. Martinez or her own growing network of trusted friends. I'm not trying to be anyone's savior, she explained in a session. I'm just trying to be the person I needed when I was struggling. Sometimes that means sharing what I've learned, but mostly it means creating spaces where people feel safe to discover their own truth. The impact of this approach became clear when Julia, after several months of their informal mentoring relationship, shared some news. I'm starting therapy, she said. Seeing you be so open about your journey helped me realize it's not about being broken. It's about being brave enough to grow. In her next session with Dr. Martinez, Emma reflected on how far she'd come from that rainy day in Central Park. It's like, all the work we've done hasn't just helped me. It's created this ripple effect I never could have imagined. That's often how healing works, Dr. Martinez noted. When we light our own lamp, we naturally illuminate the path for others. As spring bloomed outside, Emma felt something blooming within her as well, a deeper sense of purpose that transcended her personal healing. Her own journey hadn't ended. If anything, it felt richer and more nuanced as she walked alongside others on their paths. Perhaps, she wrote in her journal that evening, this is what integration really means, not just healing our own wounds, but transforming them into bridges that help others cross their own difficult waters. Maybe we're all just walking each other home, one story, one moment of understanding, one shared truth at a time. The spring breeze carried the scent of new growth through her open window. In the distance, she could hear the city humming with life, countless stories unfolding, countless journeys of healing and discovery taking place. Her own story was just one thread in this vast tapestry, but it was connecting with others in ways she never could have imagined when she first sat on that park bench, feeling alone with her pain. Now she understood. None of us heal in isolation. We heal in community, in connection, in the brave spaces we create for each other's truth to be heard and held. And in that holding, something greater than individual healing emerges, a collective wisdom, a shared strength, a light that grows brighter as it's passed from hand to hand, heart to heart. Chapter 9. Full Circle. The late spring air carried the scent of blooming trees as Emma sat in Dr. Martinez's office, holding a letter that would change everything. She'd been offered a position as senior editor at a prestigious publishing house, with the opportunity to create a new imprint focused on transformative personal narratives. A year ago, Emma said softly, "This would have terrified me. Actually, it still does, but differently. It's not paralyzing anymore. It feels more like excitement mixed with healthy fear." Dr. Martinez nodded encouragingly. "Tell me more about this different kind of fear." "Before, fear was a wall, something that stopped me. Now it feels more like a doorway, like it's showing me where I need to grow next." Emma paused, realizing something. "It's so strange. When I first came to you, I wanted to eliminate my fear and self-doubt. Now I'm learning they might actually be useful companions when I don't let them drive the car." They reflected on how far Emma had come from that first session. The transformation wasn't about becoming someone new, but rather about uncovering and embracing who she'd been all along. Her journey had been less about adding things and more about removing the layers of shoulds and protective patterns that had accumulated over years. "I had this moment in the Creative Courage group yesterday," Emma shared. "We were discussing fear of success, how sometimes we're more afraid of our light than our darkness. 5 years ago, I wouldn't have even understood that concept. Now I not only understand it, I'm living through its resolution." The new position would challenge her in ways that integrated everything she'd learned. It would require maintaining boundaries while staying open-hearted, trusting her vision while remaining collaborative, standing in her authority while continuing to grow. "What's interesting," Emma noted, "is how my definition of success has changed. Yes, this is a dream job, but what excites me most is the potential to create spaces for other voices, other stories of transformation. It feels less about achieving something and more about contributing something." Dr. Martinez smiled warmly. "You're describing a shift from external validation to internal alignment. How is that showing up in other areas of your life?" Emma thought about her strengthened relationship with her sister. Their weekly calls now filled with genuine connection rather than comparison. She thought about her blog, which had evolved into a vibrant community of people supporting each other's creative and personal growth. Even her relationship with her parents had transformed. She could now hear their concern without absorbing it as judgment. It's like Emma's search for the words, "I'm no longer trying to prove my worth or earn my place in the world. I'm just trying to show up authentically and contribute what I can." The anxiety hasn't disappeared, but it's more like background music now rather than the main song. They discussed how this integration was manifesting in practical ways. Emma had developed her own morning ritual that combined journaling, meditation, and creative writing. She'd learned to recognize her triggers and had tools for working with them. Most importantly, she'd cultivated a deep sense of self-trust. Yesterday, she shared, "I made a mistake in a team meeting, mixed up some important numbers. Before, that would have sparked a shame spiral that lasted days. Now I just corrected it, apologized once, and moved on. It felt normal, human." Dr. Martinez leaned forward slightly. "What do you think made that possible?" I finally believe that my worth isn't in my performance. Mistakes are just mistakes. They're not character flaws. And, maybe more importantly, I trust that I can handle whatever comes up." As they began discussing the transition to her new role, Emma realized something else had changed: her relationship with uncertainty. Rather than needing to have everything figured out in advance, she felt comfortable taking things step by step, trusting her ability to learn and adapt along the way. "It reminds me of something you said early in our work together," Emma reflected, "about how healing isn't linear. I think I understand that better now. It's more like a spiral. We keep encountering similar themes, but from new perspectives, with more wisdom each time." She shared how this understanding was influencing her approach to the new position. Instead of trying to arrive perfectly prepared, She was viewing it as another chapter in her ongoing growth. The skills she'd developed, self-compassion, emotional awareness, boundary setting, resilience, weren't destination points but rather tools for continuing evolution. I had this image the other day, Emma said, of life as a dance rather than a ladder. Before, I was always trying to climb to some imagined perfect state. Now I'm more interested in moving with whatever each moment brings, finding the rhythm in both the smooth and challenging parts. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. That's a beautiful metaphor. How might you carry that dance into your next chapter? Emma thought about the creative courage group she'd be leaving behind. I've already spoken with Julia about taking over as facilitator. It feels right, passing on what I've learned while continuing my own journey. Like we're all just taking turns holding the light for each other. As their session drew to a close, Emma felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over her. "Thank you," she said simply, "for helping me find my way back to myself." "You did the work," Dr. Martinez reminded her gently. "I just held the space for your own wisdom to emerge." That evening, Emma sat by her window, watching the city lights flicker to life. She opened her journal and began to write. "Dear future self, as I step into this new chapter, I carry with me these truths. I am worthy, not because of what I achieve, but because of who I am. My sensitivity is not a weakness. It's a source of insight and connection. Fear doesn't mean stop. It means pay attention and proceed mindfully. I don't have to be perfect to be valuable. Every challenge is an invitation to deepen my self-trust. My story matters, not despite, but because of its complications. I promise to keep dancing with uncertainty, to stay open to growth, to honor both my strength and my vulnerability. Most of all, I promise to remember that the light I've found was never something I needed to earn or achieve. It was always there, waiting to be uncovered. With love and trust, Emma." The spring wind carried the sound of distant music through her open window. Emma smiled, recognizing that this ending was really just another beginning. Another turn in the endless dance of becoming. Chapter 10. The Light That Remains. The morning sun filled Dr. Martinez's office with a warm, golden light as Emma arrived for one of their final sessions. A year and a half had passed since that first desperate day in Central Park. Now, with her new position starting in a month and a cross-country move to San Francisco on the horizon, they were preparing to bring their therapeutic relationship to a close. "It feels strange," Emma admitted, settling into her familiar spot on the couch. "Like saying goodbye to a close friend. Part of me wonders if I'm really ready to do this without our weekly sessions." Dr. Martinez smiled warmly. "Tell me more about that concern." "Well," Emma paused, noticing the familiar tightness in her chest that signaled anxiety. But now, instead of being overwhelmed by it, she could observe it with gentle curiosity. "I guess I'm afraid I'll lose all this progress. That without your guidance, I'll slip back into old patterns." "Interesting," Dr. Martinez noted. "And what do you know about patterns now that you didn't know when we first met?" Emma thought about this, that they're not fixed, that they're more like habits than destiny, and that awareness itself is transformative. She smiled, recognizing the wisdom she'd internalized. "I just answered my own fear, didn't I?" "You did. What else have you internalized that perhaps you haven't fully recognized?" They spent the session taking inventory of Emma's inner resources, not just the tools and techniques they practiced, but the deeper understanding she developed. She could now distinguish between her inner critic and her wisdom voice. She had practices for working with difficult emotions, strategies for maintaining boundaries, and most importantly, a fundamental trust in her own capacity to handle whatever arose. "Something shifted last week," Emma shared. "I was feeling overwhelmed about the move, and instead of calling someone or trying to fix it immediately, I just sat with the feeling. I actually got curious about it. And somehow, giving it space to exist made it feel less overwhelming." Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. "You're describing self-regulation, the ability to be present with your experience without being consumed by it. How else have you noticed this capacity showing up?" Emma thought about the previous month's challenges. Negotiating her new contract, finding an apartment in San Francisco, dealing with her parents' anxiety about her move. Each situation had tested her in different ways, but she navigated them with a steadiness that still surprised her. It's not that I don't feel fear or doubt anymore, she reflected. It's that they no longer feel like emergencies. They're more like weather patterns passing through. I can notice them without becoming them. They discussed how this inner stability wasn't about reaching some perfect state of enlightenment, but rather about developing a flexible resilience that could bend with life's challenges without breaking. Emma had learned to trust not just her strength, but also her vulnerability, recognizing that both were essential parts of being human. Last night, she shared, I was packing my apartment and found my old journals from when I first started coming here. Reading them was like meeting a different person, someone so afraid of her own shadow, so convinced of her own unworthiness. I felt such compassion for her. And what would you say to that earlier version of yourself now? Emma's eyes filled with tears, but they were gentle tears, full of understanding rather than pain. I would tell her that everything she thinks is wrong with her, her sensitivity, her deep feelings, her uncertainty, will turn out to be her greatest gifts. That all the darkness she's fighting is actually fertile soil where her strength will grow. They spent time discussing practical strategies for maintaining her progress after their sessions ended. Emma had already found a therapist in San Francisco, recommended by Dr. Martinez, for check-ins as needed. She had her support system, her sister, the online community from her blog, close friends who understood her journey. Most importantly, she had her own well-developed practices for self-care and self-reflection. I've been thinking about what you said in our first session, Emma remembered, about how healing isn't about becoming someone new, but about discovering who we've been all along. I understand that so much better now. All this work wasn't about fixing myself. It was about coming home to myself. Dr. Martinez smiled. And what does home feel like now? Spacious, Emma replied thoughtfully. Like there's room for all of me. The strong parts and the scared parts, the certain and the unsure, the light and the shadow. It's not about getting rid of the hard stuff anymore. It's about having the capacity to hold all of it with compassion. As their final sessions drew to a close, they created what Dr. Martinez called a wisdom bundle, a collection of insights, practices, and reminders Emma could carry with her. She wrote them in a new journal, not as rules to follow, but as gentle guideposts for the journey ahead. Remember, your worth is inherent, not earned. Feelings are information, not commands. Boundaries are acts of love. Vulnerability is strength. Growth is spiral, not linear. You can begin again at any moment. The light within you never dims. It only gets covered or uncovered. On their last day together, Dr. Martinez handed Emma a small box. Inside was a beautiful compass, its face etched with the words, "Trust your inner light." Not because you need direction, Dr. Martinez explained, seeing Emma's questioning look, but as a reminder that you've always had the wisdom to find your way. Our work together wasn't about me giving you answers. It was about helping you clear away what was blocking your own inner guidance. Emma held the compass carefully, feeling its weight in her palm. I used to think healing meant reaching a point where nothing hurt anymore, she said softly. Now I understand it's about having the courage to stay open to life, all of it, and trusting that I can handle whatever comes. And you can, Dr. Martinez affirmed. You always could. As Emma prepared to leave their final session, she turned at the door. How do I thank you for helping me find myself? Dr. Martinez's eyes were warm with understanding. Live your truth. Share your light. Keep dancing with uncertainty. That's all the thanks I need. That evening, Emma sat by her window one last time in her New York apartment. The city lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere in the distance, music played. She opened her journal and wrote, "The journey doesn't end here. In many ways, it's just beginning. But I carry forward something precious, not just tools and techniques, but a deep knowing that I am enough, exactly as I am. The light I sought was never outside me. It was always here, waiting patiently for me to remember. And now, stepping into this new chapter, I carry that light with me, not as something I need to protect or prove, but as something that simply is, as natural as breathing, as constant as the stars, as true as my own heart beating." The real journey was never about becoming someone else. It was about becoming fully myself. And that journey continues, endless as the sky, rich with possibility, full of grace. Outside, the night was deep and clear. Emma closed her journal, feeling the compass in her pocket, knowing that whatever lay ahead, she had everything she needed within her. The light that had guided her home would light her way forward, step by step, moment by moment, into all the chapters yet to come. Epilogue: Seeds of Light. 1 year later, the San Francisco fog rolled in from the bay as Emma stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd gathered for the launch of her publishing house's new imprint, Inner Light Books. The faces before her weren't just audience members. They were fellow travelers, each carrying their own stories of transformation. When I first started this journey, she began, her voice steady and warm. I thought healing meant becoming someone else, someone stronger, better, more perfect. What I discovered instead was that true healing isn't about transformation into something new, but rather a return to who we've always been beneath the layers of who we thought we should be. The compass Dr. Martinez had given her rested in her pocket, a familiar weight against her hip. She didn't need to check it anymore, but its presence reminded her of how far she'd come and the wisdom she carried within. Her new office overlooked the bay, and she designed it with intention. Plants thrived on every windowsill. Comfortable chairs invited genuine conversation. And on one wall hung a collection of framed notes from readers whose lives had been touched by the books they'd published. Each one represented a light rekindled, a story of someone finding their way back to themselves. The blog that had started as a personal healing journal had evolved into a vibrant online community, the Light Keepers. Members shared their journeys, supported each other's growth, and celebrated the small victories that marked their paths. Emma's role had shifted from leader to facilitator, creating space for other voices to emerge. Her relationship with her family had deepened in unexpected ways. Her sister Sarah had started her own therapy journey, inspired by the changes she'd witnessed in Emma. Their conversations now held a richness that came from mutual understanding and shared growth. Even her parents, initially worried about her cross-country move, had begun to see and appreciate the woman she'd become. The monthly video calls with her Creative Courage group in New York, now led by Julia, filled her heart with joy. Watching them support each other, seeing how the seeds of healing continued to sprout and grow, reminded her that transformation was never a solitary journey. She still had regular check-ins with her new therapist in San Francisco, not because she was broken or struggling, but because she valued the ongoing practice of self-reflection and growth. Some patterns still emerged. Old fears occasionally surfaced, but now she welcomed them as familiar companions on her journey rather than enemies to be vanquished. The light within us, she told the audience, isn't something we need to create or earn. It's our natural state, always present, even when clouded by doubt or fear. Our work isn't to become something different, but to remember what we've always been. After the event, as she walked along the beach near her new home, Emma reflected on what Dr. Martinez had taught her about the ongoing nature of growth. The waves rolled in and out, each one different yet part of the same eternal dance. Her healing journey hadn't ended. It had simply matured into a deeper understanding of life's continuous unfolding. She took out her journal, its pages now filled with a year of West Coast reflections, and wrote, "Dear Light Seekers, the truth I wish I'd known at the beginning is this. You are not broken. You are not a problem to be solved or a project to be fixed. You are a magnificent unfolding of life itself, learning and growing and becoming more fully yourself with each step, each breath, each moment of awareness. The darkness you feel isn't your enemy. It's the fertile soil where your wisdom grows. Your sensitivity isn't a weakness. It's your greatest strength. Your doubts aren't failures. They're invitations to deeper truth. I used to think healing meant reaching a destination where everything would finally be perfect. Now I know that healing is about embracing the journey itself, with all its uncertainties and challenges, all its joys and discoveries. The light within you never dims. It may be obscured, forgotten, or hidden, but it remains as constant as the stars, as vast as the sky, as deep as the ocean. Your task isn't to create this light. It's to remember it, to clear away what blocks it, to let it shine in its own unique way. And when you forget, as we all do sometimes, when the clouds of doubt roll in, as they always will, remember this: you are not alone. We are all here, holding the light for each other, creating spaces where truth can be spoken, where hearts can be heard, where souls can remember their way home. The journey continues, endless as the waves, beautiful as the fog rolling over the hills, rich with possibility and grace. And you, exactly as you are an essential part of this unfolding story. Keep shining, Emma. The fog was lifting now, revealing patches of blue sky above. Somewhere in New York, Dr. Martinez was probably tending her garden, nurturing new growth. In offices and homes across the country, members of the Lightkeepers community were living their own stories of transformation. In San Francisco, a new chapter was unfolding, not just for Emma, but for all those whose lives would be touched by the books they would publish, the stories they would tell, the lights they would help rekindle. Emma closed her journal and stood, feeling the sand beneath her feet, the wind in her hair, the compass in her pocket, the light in her heart. She was home, not in any physical place, but in herself. And from this place of deep belonging, anything was possible. The journey continues.